Hi everyone, and welcome to the second lecture in the summer school, Archaeology 3013, Experimenting with Archaeology. So last week, to recap, was the very general question of what is archaeology? And there are a broad range of what archaeology is. There are a lot of other disciplines, geology, anthropology, multimedia, all sorts of things and disciplines and people we work with. But today's lecture is part of the before sequence of doing archaeology. Remember, this unit has a tripartite structure, the before, during and after of archaeological project management. And what we're doing today is recognizing and recording sites. So these are skills you need to have before you go into the field. Obviously, there's a little bit of chicken and egg in that you need some field experience, but there are a lot of stuff in terms of background research that you do and compliance that you do before coming to the field. So on this title slide, you'll see a number of things, for example, showing archaeologists working underwater and some of the technology, GPS and drones that we use. We have a very simple structure over the next 38 slides. There are 40 slides, and all of the slides are available as PDF versions of the PowerPoint that you can get from the LMS. So we're going to cover some laws and ethics. There's also some occupational health and safety in that section. Then we're going to move on to research, design and brief. We did a little bit of that last lecture, but you can't have enough of it, so we'll do it in brief. Then ask the question, well, what exactly are artifacts and sites? How do you recognize them out in the field? And to answer this question, the issue of scale, small and large, from individual artifacts to total cultural landscapes that stretch across countries, sometimes becomes relevant. And then how do you record the sites? I'm going to give you some basic principles of recording. Of course, when we meet again, we will be doing the actual recording by excavation and survey, and then a quick summary of what we're doing. All right, so let's get cracking. As always, I should remind us that we are on Whadjuk Noongar land, and that my name is Sven Usman, and I'm one of the unit coordinators. Right, archaeology always has to be lawful, it has to be ethical, it has to be safe. We exist in society, we're not separate from society, we are not above its laws, and we need some laws and guidelines that are particular to archaeology. In fact, we've got a lot of laws in terms of, especially when we do fieldwork. There are rules, there are ordinances, there are laws, there are ethics, there are unwritten rules, there are all sorts of do's and don'ts. And they form a complex web or matrix within which our actions are enabled and constrained. And just to make things delicious, these laws and ordinances don't always say the same thing, and sometimes they flat out come at right angles and contradict each other. But we're going into the field and you're being trained as heritage experts, as archaeologists, and the various publics, clients, governments, indigenous communities, etc. that we serve look to us for expert advice. So in any given situation, we need to be able to be aware of what all the laws, safety, ethics, and those sorts of things are, and how to work with those so that our work is lawful, that it complies with all the laws, but also that it's culturally appropriate. So let's have a go on this. This is actually a section I really like. My mother said I should be a lawyer. She still thinks archaeology is a hobby, but I think she's partway right. Moms often do know best, and heritage law is a really fascinating field. Did you know, for example, that when a ship that is on government business during a time of war sinks, and if someone on it dies, that ship is no longer classified as an artifact or an object, it is reclassified as a war grave, and legislation relating to human remains pertains to it, for example. In the US, for example, they've also had in rem motions where, for example, an artifact can be constituted as a juridical person and can take the government to court. Nice, huh? Okay, ethics. Often people think ethics are a little bit wishy-washy. They're not. We in archaeology take them very, very seriously. Ethics give us the spirit, the social license and contract in which we operate. Of course, we have to be lawful, but sometimes people are lawful, but a little bit naughty, and they're not really obeying the spirit of the law, just the letter of the law. So we would say any archaeologist in any country, a reputable archaeologist, we would expect to belong to the National Archaeological Association and be bound by its code of ethics. Now in Australia we have two such associations. There's the Australian Association of Archaeologists, membership is open to almost anyone. You as students can join this. It costs, I think, about $70 a year. You're part of a large network. You get the professional journal gets given to you. There's a national conference, but you are bound by the Code of Ethics. So that's one. And the other one is the Australian Association of Consulting Archaeologists. Most archaeologists work in the consulting or business field, and they also have a Code of Ethics. These two codes of ethics are not quite the same, but they're very congruent with each other. So here are some screenshots, but if we click on the two, if we go to the AAA, as it's often known as Code of Ethics, it takes you to the web page of the association, and you can see here Code of Ethics. It has a foreword. Members will serve the interests of the association by adhering to its objects and purposes, etc., etc. And it tells you a whole lot of things over there that are just part of the foreword. But then there are various principles that relate to the archaeological record. You can see it's not too complicated, 3 of them. For example, members will neither engage in nor support the illicit trade in cultural heritage. In other words, looting and selling things on eBay. Recently, December 2017, there's been a case of Tasmanian stone tools that have been sold over eBay by people in Sydney, and this is currently being investigated by the law. And there are also principles relating to Indigenous archaeology that you can see over here. Members acknowledge Indigenous approaches to the interpretation of cultural heritage and its conservation. Note it says acknowledge. It doesn't say you have to agree with these, but you just have to acknowledge that archaeology is not the only point of view out there. And then as an archaeologist, there are principles relating to your conduct, that you work in a professional, honest, timely manner. If we then go to the ACA Code of Ethics, click over here. ACA is a slightly different website, but it's a nice clear one. You will then see as it loads that, so these are much more business orientated. This is there to protect the archaeologist from, for example, litigation by clients. And there's their Code of Ethics. They have Code of Ethics. Members agree that as archaeologists we have certain responsibilities to the public, our employers, and clients and colleagues. Right? And so they have different bits, not unlike the AAA Code of Ethics, but a little bit different. Duty to the public, duty to certain groups, duty to informants, duty to the profession, duty to the employer or client, matters of fact, matters of opinion. So that's important. There are certain things we know as archaeologists, and there are certain things that we have an informed opinion on, but they're not the same thing. Bear in mind that you're often advising clients. It might be a multi-million-dollar project, and if you give bad advice, you could cost the company a great deal of loss. On the other hand, we've got to judge the archaeological record to say, well, what are the needs of the past? What are the needs of the present? How can we try and reconcile these? Archaeologists are certainly not against development. A prosperous country and state pays for a lot of heritage protection, legislation, jobs, etc. At the same time, there are certain heritages that might be unique and which you wouldn't touch. You wouldn't, for example, put a strip mall at the Great Pyramid of Giza, for example. But there are many other small sites in Egypt where people do build over old ruins after recording those ruins. So that's just to give you an idea of the ethical codes. So ethical misconduct can be extremely serious. If you're found guilty of ethical misconduct, it'll probably ruin your career. So you always have to be aware of what the ethics of a situation are. More positively, if you have a reputation as a good and ethical worker, many doors open for you. People like working with you. They know you're reputable. They like what you do. They work with you. So that's all good. So just bear that in mind. There are certain specialities. So within archaeology, we have forensic anthropologists and archaeologists that work with us, and often they work on human remains, either archaeological remains that are quite old or more recent victims of crime or accident. When you're working with humans, living either human remains, human tissue in one form or another, or, for example, interviewing people, live subjects, as it's often referred to in legislation, typically your organization or employer will require an ethics clearance. In this slide, you can see the UWA's Human Research Ethics Officer's application, the first couple of pages. And what they want to do here is, number one, that they want to protect you, to make sure that you're not sued or you don't do a misstep or you don't do harm to the profession. But it's also to protect all the people that work around you. So very much you want to keep that in mind and make sure you have all the right paperwork done. Now this can take quite a long time, weeks and sometimes months, permits to work on sites from the state regulator, for example, can take 6 to 8 weeks. So you need to build that into all of your research and fieldwork plans. Moving on to laws. So laws are codified. Laws generally exist as legislation. They will often have a reading speech that goes with them, and they will have a set of regulations, plus the fourth element, which is case law. So case law is where cases have come up in court and a judge and or jury has decided on something. The law itself is a fairly blunt and general instrument. It gives broad guidance on an issue, but the regulations and case law then give specific guidance. They give that spirit of the law rather than just the letter of the law. Now, in Western Australia, we have an interesting situation in which we have 3 sets of heritage laws. We have the Aboriginal Heritage Act of Western Australia from 1972. We have the Heritage Act, which deals largely with historic or colonial heritage from 1990. The Act is from 1990, not the heritage. And then we have the Historic Shipwrecks Act that deals largely with shipwrecks. So these are the state laws. There are also other federal laws, such as the Environmental Conservation Act. There are even international laws, such as UNESCO conventions. And then going the other way, you might have regional laws to a shire, local laws, a particular municipality, and you might have some very specific ordinances that are at work. For example, when we excavate, we also have to do dial before you dig to see if we hit any cables or anything like this. So the issue we have in WA is these 3 laws interpret the past and its regulation a little bit differently. My opinion as a professional is that we need one heritage legislation for the whole state. That's going to take some time, and that's going to be a challenge that your generation is also going to deal with. But let me show you some of the peculiarities we land in by having these different laws. And the first one is on Wajimub. So Wajimub is a Noongar word for Wajak word for Rottnest Island, just off of Perth. So Rottnest Island, people forget 7,000 years ago when ocean levels were lower, Rottnest Island was in fact part of mainland Australia. So it was not an island, it was a land site. And we've got archaeological artefacts that people like Charlie Dortch have found there going back thousands and thousands of years. But Rottnest also has a colonial history, both good and bad. It was used as a prison, particularly for Aboriginal people. And Aboriginal people taken from all over the state, people I work with up in the Kimberley today, Indigenous Australians, have parents and grandparents that were incarcerated on Rottnest and Fremantle Prison, for example. And one of the things they had to do was build. They were forced labour for example, the lighthouse on Wajimub on Rottnest. And interestingly, the plaque put up at the time talks about erected in the 13th year of the colony through means of the native prisoners. So the historic plaque recognises the native, we wouldn't use that word today perhaps, but Aboriginal labour that is in the site. But say now there's a heritage infraction, someone goes and puts graffiti on the site. Which law are you going to use to prosecute the person? The Aboriginal Heritage Act, acknowledging the Aboriginal labour, or the Heritage Act, acknowledging the colonial structure? Also, the legislation has different penalties for the same offence. So destruction under the one Act, the Aboriginal Heritage Act, carries a roughly $200,000 fine. The same offence under the Heritage Act carries a $500,000 fine. So it's fine. It's not deliberate, it's just the chaos of government, but we need to regularize things like that. So this is the field you're going to be working with, different kinds of laws. So sometimes you have to get legal opinion on some work, other times you will get a lot of experience as you go through the system and you'll know how best to work. Another example, which was in the last lecture on Gallop House, which I use here for continuity, is you need permission to work on the land you're working on. Just because a client wants you to do work somewhere or you yourself want to do a research project somewhere, you first have to see, well, who owns that land? So Gallop House is a great, or Nunalgarup is a great example because they're different land tenures. The house itself is owned by the National Trust. So any work on the house, there it is over there, you go to the National Trust, no problem. But the land around it is owned by both the City of Nedlands and the Department of Parks and Wildlife with an historic agreement with the Swan River Trust. So there are a number of different things. And the whole of the river, if you look in this screenshot here of AHIS, the Aboriginal Heritage Information System, the system one of the databases you're going to have to use for your final project, in addition to the State Heritage Office's Inherit database. That shows that the whole of the Swan River is a sacred site, and any work there requires a permit from the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, now the Department of Planning. So let's go into AHIS. So if I click over there, it calls it up. It takes a little bit of time to load, so you can make a cup of coffee or something like that. I did load it earlier over here. So there you have the whole of Australia. Now if you want to find out something about the Swan River, there are various ways of doing it. You can go, what do you want to do? You want to search for registered sites. Okay, so let's do that. It'll load. Remember, this is specific to Western Australia only. This is the Western Australian Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage. That said, it is a third of the country, so it's pretty big. Let's do it. So registered Aboriginal sites. We want to search for them in, let's call it a locality, suburb or town. The one we want to have a look at, and we go down, down, down to Perth. Perth, where'd Perth go? Right at the bottom. So we go to Perth, and let's go search. So what it's doing now is it's busy loading a whole lot of sites over the years that have been entered as important, and you get these color-coded maps. Here it's just telling you about an Indigenous land usage disclaimer, so that's a legal document. You need to read that. So I have read that many times. And while it renders, you can see all of these hatched red areas are in one way or another sites, and all of these numbers. So the whole of the river is a site. Up here near Guildford, we've got a site that's 40,000 years old. Here near Mosman Park, we've got a 9,000-year-old site, Aboriginal site. Gallop House has colonial history and history that's before that. So we're more or less, if we look near UWA, you can click on these. So you click on something like that, and what it will do is it will give you a record of what's there. So this is busy loading. You can see there are a great many sites. Anytime archaeological work is done, afterwards you have to hand in a report, and then that informs any subsequent work. So that's our site there. It tells you it's the Swan River. How's that for a site? A whole river can be a site. You want to view some additional details. This often has links to PDFs and other sources of information that then deepen your knowledge. So number one, you need to know the location. Then you need to know the appropriate database. And here on the left-hand side, you can see it has a particular ID number, so you can go to the DAA and say, please tell me a bit more about this site. It's a registered site, it's mythological, there are no gendered restriction, the file is not restricted, the location is not restricted, and so on. So you can request additional information. Similarly, if you go to Inherit the State database and you go, let's type in Gallop, it won't recognize Null group. There we come up, there we say, okay, good, and it says we have a Gallop Hall, that's up in the Pilbara, so no, we're not interested in that. But information about this place, Birdwood Parade, yes, that's correct. Both the City of Nedlands and the Heritage Council have information about it, and there you go. You get a whole bit of information, you get reference numbers, and you get links to other kinds of information. So those are the databases that you're going to be using, and those are the databases that are going to give you the land tenure. Who owns what? So who do you approach for permission, and what form does that permission take, for example? So tricky, quite tricky. We had to get multiple permissions to work on Gallop House, and it took about 4 months to do so. Then everyone was on board, everyone really enjoyed the project. It would have been very different if we had not done all of that. Moving on to occupational health and safety. This is a concern for all workers. So we all have to have OH&S. Archaeologists work everywhere. We work on land, we work underwater. There are even archaeologists that do space archaeology, and I'll get onto that in the last few slides. So you have to make sure that you're safe, and everyone you're working with and around is safe, that your work doesn't impact negatively on anyone, and that while you're working, that everyone is safe, that there are no incidents or those kinds of things. And there are 101 things you have to keep in mind. You have to make sure everyone's insurance is up to date. You have to make sure your equipment is adequate to the task. If you're working in an area that's hot, you need to have sun protection. We work up in the Kimberley, and we have to have risk assessment plans for example, crocodiles and poisonous fauna and flora and feral animals, and what you get to do when you get bogged and all of those different kinds of things. When you excavate, the WorkSafe Act says if you go below 1.6 meters, you have to have professional shoring before. So you have to have a risk assessment and a fieldwork plan in place before you go to the field. You've got to anticipate what the possible hazards can be and how you will mitigate that. And you've got to inform everyone on your team about that. So for this unit, for example, you will undergo a lab safety induction. So you know what the hazards are. Knowing what the hazards are is the first step in preventing them. Then you don't go, oops, you prevent that oops sort of thing. When people are excavating and they go, oh, then we go, But had they known about what the hazards are, the risks would have been mitigated. So here is just a screenshot of some of the hazard identification checklist. UWA has all sorts of different things that you have to go through. You know, you're working in an urban area. Is it overseas fieldwork? Are there mechanical hazards? Fire fieldwork? All of those different kinds of things. And then as a planning process, put out as a kind of organogram, what are the different steps you have to follow in terms of what's happening. So all fieldwork at UWA, these steps apply, but if you're doing any diving or water work, then these steps apply. For maritime archaeologists, that part would apply. For example, we've had a team working on the Batavia shipwreck for many years, and they have to go through this, and we all have to go through this. So that's occupational health and safety, all done before you get to the field. One thing people don't often recognize is cultural safety. So cultural safety, we work on other people's lands. They can be indigenous people, they can be other people. Those of you who've done anthropology will know about the obligations of hosts and guests. In other words, if you go to someone's house, you have to behave in a certain way. You probably can't nick any of the family silver, but they have to keep you safe, be hospitable, all of those different kinds of things. So there are various cultural and legal protocols. Aboriginal people in Australia have very strong attachments to land, not just land, but all the forces that they know to be in and around that land. And they consider themselves to have a duty of care towards you. They've got to look after you while you're on their land. And that includes excluding you from some places you might not go. If you go to those places, in their knowledge system, it will cause an upset. It will cause damage to yourself, and it will cause damage to the host community. So they're not keeping you away as a display of power. They might be keeping you away because of their duty of care. They've got to look after you. And so you have to listen to those cultural protocols and obey them. That builds respect. You don't always have to agree with them. There can be gender restrictions. Sometimes academics say, but I have academic freedom. I can look at anything I like anywhere in the world. At a certain level, that's probably true. But you have to realize that cultural safety, like ethics, this is just something we do. It's against the background of a larger reconciliation agenda, but very often, you're working on someone's land, and if you're not going to respect their cultural norms, they're not going to give you legal permission to work on those lands. With laws, ethics, and cultural safety, these are situational. They exist at different scales. They're personal scales, your personal beliefs. There are situational scales, the situation you find yourself in. So sometimes I, as a male, am excluded from women's sites. I think males and females are equivalent to each other, and I think I should probably be allowed to go to either site. It has nothing to do with my maleness or my femaleness, but in that situation, I obey that rule. Of course, we also have our places of work that have certain rules as well, and they might conflict with some of those other rules. And these are part of the negotiations you have to undergo with yourself in terms of laws, ethics, occupational health and safety, and cultural safety protocols. Right, so now we've covered all of those. Now we move on to your research, design, and briefing. So every project that you are on, even if it's a one-day quick project in the commercial sector for a client, you must be trying to save the archaeological research potential. Maybe you don't look at that site. Maybe it takes years and years and years before someone works at a site. I was curator of archaeology at Iziko South African Museum in Cape Town, and it was really great to see how shell beads excavated in the 1960s and stored in the collection were then re-looked at in the late 2000s, 2009, 2010, by people doing microwear analysis, and the little holes in the shells that in the 1960s were thought to be natural holes, the microwear analysts could see these were purposefully made by people. What makes this special is that these were in layers that are about 60 to 50,000 years old. So they relate to human symbolic behavior, this big question we have in archaeology. So suddenly an old artifact produced new research results. So that's what you've got to plan. We can never research everything about a site or artifact, but we can record it well enough. Welcome to ARCY. We can record it well enough that we can recover that research potential for others. Other things that you need to do in your research design, a lot of it's just practical. How much money have you got at your disposal, and how much is the project going to cost? How much time is it going to take? What personnel do you need? Do you need specialist skills? What are the deliverables? When must they be delivered by? So you're just organizing your work in a very structured sort of way. And it's best not to get too complicated, have clear sequential goals. Many archaeologists have a template that they then fill in for each archaeological project with some variation to account for the peculiarities of the project. But you're never just going out and surveying or digging or recording. There's always a purpose in mind. Make sure you know what that purpose is. So sometimes in the textbook that we recommend, the Archaeologist Field Handbook, they have this for a more academic project in which you have these different steps put out like an organogram. So number one, decide on a broad area of study that you're interested in. Read about that study. Who has said what? Where are the gaps? Look out for the research problem. You don't want to confirm what people have said. You want to produce new knowledge. So here, think how you can extend or improve an idea, and look for suggestions that other people have made in this field that are worthwhile studying. And then think practically about how are you in fact going to do this project. So this is where you get really obsessive compulsive, really organized, because it'll save you a lot of time in the field. Fieldwork is expensive. It's expensive in terms of time, money, and expertise, and you can reduce that expense through good planning. Workflows are important, so that organogram, another way of doing it is you have your before, your sort of intermediate, I suppose. So this is the before, the during, and the after. So beforehand, look at the literature on the subject. Who has said what? Look at maps to see what sites are known, whether you're using AIS, Inherit, other archaeologists' maps. Have you got funding? If not, source your funding. Interview, snoop on the internet, talk to other disciplines. Reflexivity is about, well, think reflexively about what you're doing and why you're doing it. Maybe hold a seminar and in terms of what you want to do to get input from your peers, from your colleagues, from other people. Get all your permits and schedules in order, what we've just been talking about. Have lots of discussions with people, know what you're going to be identifying in the field. Then you go to the field and you do the actual field work as efficiently as possible. Afterwards, you make sure you report, you publish, you do outreach, you satisfy the conditions of your permit, and that you store the artifacts in curatorially sound ways. We'll be covering that in this course. So that's another way of doing the before, during, and after. Your research design, your planning, your brief, before you get out there into the field. Alrighty. So now we need to think, well, what is an artifact and site? I've got to get out there, and partly you will learn the answer to this question through experience, and partly through lectures like this. Okay, so I'm bringing in the artifact from last lecture, the Westhoff's hand axe, to say, well, we have here the Westhoff's hand axe. It is an artifact. Artifact comes from the Latin artefactum, a thing made by skill, so it's something made by humans, out of stone, bone. The material doesn't matter, just something made by humans. It can be a small bit of pottery, or it can be a huge building. Well, that's technically a feature. But in this case, a single artifact is also a site. Where we have the presence or absence of material culture, same word for artifacts or sites, we also have a site. The Westhoff's case, we knew there were about 4 hand axes, so they are forming a small site. At the same time, we have up on Murujuga, the Burra Peninsula, we have areas in which you have just carpets of stone tools, but in a discrete geographic area. There are literally millions of individual stone tools, and it's still one site. Sometimes, though, you have a concentration of artifacts, then you have no artifacts, then you have more artifacts. And that might be 2 sites or 2 parts of one site. Stepping back, a site is simply a place where human activity has occurred. Now, usually this human activity will leave some sort of trace, an artifact, a campsite, a factory, a modern shipyard. We're still producing sites today. Although technically it can be where someone has had a dream. Biblical references in the Islamic literature, some of these dreams are foundational to the formation of those religions. but that dream leaves no trace. So that site is unknown unless it's through oral history or been recorded in some other way. So where you have an artifact, you have a site. So you need to identify the artifact first. And this is where scale comes important, because sometimes you have to recognize really tiny artifacts, and I'll get into an example in which the pH and the phosphate content of soil gives us information is a kind of artifact, an ecofact technically. You might have tiny stone tools, or in the screenshot here you have the whole Angkor Wat cultural landscape that just goes over kilometers and kilometers and kilometers. So you need to be able to recognize sites at a very local level and at a broad landscape level. So it's quite tricky, and experience will help you with this. So artifacts, another way of looking at them, they're not only made by human beings, but they owe their position in time and place, particularly placed to human beings. So sometimes you'll find a rock that doesn't belong in a particular place. It comes from a different geology, and it hasn't been transported there by water, by glaciers, or anything like that. It's been brought by a human. That human might have used it as the sides of a fire pit to enclose a fire pit, but it otherwise has no cultural modification, other than it was brought from one place to another. We call this a manuport, and we consider that an artifact as well. But artifacts can be spectacular, like the Sutton Hoo helmet. They can be people's junk. A lot of archaeology is we look through people's garbage heaps. They're incredibly instructive, for example. And we analyze those. They can be beautiful rock paintings, all sorts of different things. Artifacts are continually being made. Archaeology is still being produced today and at all periods of human history. When you get a number of artifacts together, you have a site, but you can also have features. So I've just been talking about the fire pit. So these rocks don't occur in this area. You can see there are no rocks over here. So clearly these rocks, and technically the wood pile as well, although that will tend not to survive unless you have very special preservational contexts, owe their position in time and place to human agency. So these manuports came here. And then you have huge features like the Taj Mahal. It's an architectural feature that is also a site, and it is also an artifact. An interesting one are ecofacts. So these are, in inverted commas, natural things that influence or are influenced by human behavior. And there's a great study of the urinating Neanderthal. This was a discovery made in 2017, so very recent research. And what happened it's an Eastern European country, in this large cave where Neanderthals were known to exist. When archaeologists do their work, you'll notice the nitrile gloves being worn here. They collect the artifacts, they map them in 3 dimensions, where they are in time-space, working very carefully, because excavation is destruction. Once you've excavated an area, you can never excavate it again. So record keeping, the second part of this lecture, is incredibly important. You have to be as precise as you can, and you have to recover as much information as you can. So one thing archaeologists do, from every stratigraphic layer or layer they excavate, we retain a soil sample. We take a bulk soil sample, because in there are ecofacts like pollens. Pollens last for a long time, and phytoliths, and they tell you about the botany of an area, and the botany in turn tells you about the climate of an area at different points in time as you excavate down through the layers. But in this case, what they found is they did some DNA testing of the soil, and to cut a long story short is they found a place where a Neanderthal, the DNA was Neanderthal DNA, had urinated. So someone, a very human moment, had walked along and had relieved themselves. And that left a trace that hundreds of thousands of years later, or I think it was 120,000 years later, but you can read more here at Science Magazine, and click on that URL. But tens of thousands of years later, that trace is still there in the soil. So this ecofact tells us about urine. Things like feces are sometimes preserved and give us a lot of information about people's health, about their diet. Think of Ötzi, the Iceman, the 5,000-year-old Iceman. These might be things that sound gross to folks, but these are really interesting ecofacts that tell us a great deal about human history. Right, so we've got artifacts, we've got features, we've got ecofacts, and then we have an assemblage. Assemblage is simply a group of artifacts together. Single finds on their own are not particularly informative. We can learn certain things about it, but it's the relationships between an artifact and other artifacts, between the stratigraphic geological layer it occurs in, between features, between ecofacts, that gives it its meaning. It's all about context and relationships. So in this diagram here of a Mississippian burial, none of the human remains are showing, we see the burial is near a post hole. The pottery tells us that this is an agriculturalist people, but that their subsistence, clamshell, fish and oyster, tells us that they are largely maritime and water-based, for example. So no one of those artifacts would have given you that story. You need all of them together in an assemblage to give you that story. And most sites are an assemblage. There are sometimes single artifacts. A woman goes out and gathers, or a man goes out and hunts, or maybe a woman goes out and hunts and a man goes out and gathers, and they lose an artifact out in the gathering fields. That still is a site, though it's a single artifact and doesn't form part of assemblage. But 9 times out of 10, archaeological artifacts are found in assemblage. So like I said, it can be that one site over there, or you can have an assemblage. So the assemblages exist within these layers. These are what are known as closed contexts. They belong to different time periods, but they exist in relation to each other, and you can tell a story from them. Archaeology is essentially storytelling. Storytelling informed by science, informed by facts, but we need to get all that information, put it together, and tell an interesting story. So a site can be something that just happened in a very short period of time. People were moving across a landscape and they camped for a night or two, or it could be somewhere where people lived for many tens of thousands of years. Places like Gallop House, Sydney, many of the great cities of the world are often built on archaeological sites, for example. So taking it, expanding it a step further, you have cultural landscapes. So the sites are collections of artifacts, ecofacts, features, etc., but they themselves exist within a larger cultural context. There are very few human cultures that exist at a single site. So here, for example, you've got all sorts of cultural sites across Africa that are on the African World Heritage Site list. The cultural landscapes can be in a relatively small area, or they can be in a big area. So here I've taken the convict site. So in Australia we have a UNESCO World Heritage Site landscape made up of a number of prisons, colonial prisons in Australia and offshore. And you notice there's one here in WA. So each of these separate sites, there are 11 of them over here, are part of one cultural landscape in the UNESCO scheme of things. And I've left a little question for you here, asking you, so in WA we have, I believe, 7 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, but only one of those has been inscribed purely on cultural grounds. Now bear in mind, Western Australia is a third of Australia. It contains history from over 50,000 years ago right through to today. What do you think that site is? Not what do you think, go do some research. Find out what our only cultural UNESCO World Heritage Site is, and then think, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It's an interesting one, so give it some thought. So these are the different scales of archaeology, from tiny little artifacts and ecofacts to assemblages to sites and to cultural landscapes. That's recognizing archaeology out there in the field. And let's go a step further. How about out there in space? Not so much aliens. They may or may not exist, and it'll be interesting to see how we deal with them or how they deal with us. Probably eat us, I imagine. But we as a colonizing species, we've got a lot of stuff that we've left up out in space. There are a couple of really nice maps on the internet that map space junk. But some years ago, California in the US passed state legislation deeming what we might call space junk as heritage artifacts and subject to earthly heritage laws. Interesting, huh? And we have a colleague, Alice Gorman, over in Flinders University in Adelaide, Perth's closest sister, and she's known as Dr. Space Junk. So you can look at this article over here to see what she looks at. She looks at terrestrial sites like space launching stations, and she looks at the space junk that's wandering around in outer space. She looks at them both because they tell us things about human behavior. They've got interesting information about the space race during the Cold War, but they also have safety issues. So modern rockets, satellites, etc. going up into the Earth. The GPS on your phones, for example, is governed by 27 different satellites owned by the US military. And they bump into the space junk from time to time, which might in fact destroy some of those satellites. So we need to think, how do we manage these artifacts in outer space? How do we manage them so that they're not a risk, but how do we also recognize their heritage value? So that's another scale at which archaeological work works. Righto, into the second part of the lecture about finding sites. So getting out there into the field and recording them. Recording is the next part, but this is a prelude to it. So now that you know more or less what to look for, how do you go out and do it? So there are a number of different ways of doing it. Beforehand, you do your archival research. You might do things like predictive modeling, saying, well, hunter-gatherer peoples might stick closer to water than inland, so we'll focus our search along the water. Always be careful, though, to do the foot survey, these field surveys. No substitute for walking the landscape and seeing what is there. Even so, you might not see what's there, because there might be things below your feet, and stuff like ground-penetrating radar, metal detecting, what we call remote sensing techniques, give an insight as to what's below your feet. Often natural erosional contexts where a river has cut through or animals have burrowed give us little insights, because we can't necessarily dig everywhere. We do shovel testing, but we do have to have the right permits and permissions in for them. So by doing these different steps, this is how we go. You ask people as well, where are the sites? And often they'll say, 50 steps that way, or you've just walked over it, kind of thing. So there are a lot of ways of finding the sites. It just takes practice. Things like drones can fly overhead and can look at a large chunk of landscape, note any unusual features, and we can then download the footage from drones and work out which transects we're going to look for sites on. We're in favor of foot surveys, but you can't walk the whole continent, so sometimes you have to do random stratified samples, look in certain areas rather than other areas. But there are lots of ways of finding sites. Once you've found the site, anywhere where there's evidence of human activity, you have to record it. And again, this gets recorded at different kinds of scales. Now, there's an astonishing variety of information. So you've got to record as much as you can. At the same time, you have constraints of time, money, personnel, equipment. So you've got to do the best you can in the circumstances. And there have to be certain minimum standards. So here in the picture, we've got Joe Dortch. Some of you might know him, an archaeologist here at UWA, and he's been working in WA for a long time, recording up in the Pilbara, good old-fashioned pen and paper, good old-fashioned bags. But we also have things like barcodes and all of those different kinds of things. So the scales at which you record, you need to have specific information about that artifact and that site, but that information needs to be in a standardized format so that other archaeologists can use it working on similar kinds of sites or to compare and contrast sites across a landscape. So you've got to do quite a lot of work at a lot of different scales. So let's go through that. Number one, you need to have your own field notebook. Most of our recording these days we do on tablets, so it's in a nice electronic format that helps export data. It helps with standardized names. Some people call something pottery, other people call it ceramics, and if you look for the one, you won't find the other. But a personal field notebook is really important. This is where you put a record of the day's work and any information that strikes you as interesting. This provides valuable context to the site forms, electronic or physical site forms that you're using. Field notebooks don't have to be anything fancy. It's a combination of text, maps, and things. This is a copy from my field notebook, for example. Do remember, though, that it does also become a legal document. So if there's a dispute or something like that, people can look at it. So be careful of not putting any scandalous information in there. Right, so with your field notebook, the first thing you want to know is where is the site? What is the location? The absolute minimum we need is a coordinate for a site. We need to know where it is in the world. So ideally you record it with a GPS coordinate against a known datum. And we'll go over some of this in the practical hands-on days using exactly this GPS, the eTrex, nice simple one, showing you where various kinds of sites are. Once you have got a coordinate for the site, you have it on the GPS and you write it down in your field notebook. So you want the same information in a number of different forms. So for example, if you drop the eTrex from a dizzy height and it breaks and all the information is lost, you still have a hard copy with it. Or if you lose your field notebook in the river, you still have the locations on the GPS. Then you need to give each of your sites a unique alphanumeric code. So it can be very simple. This year we found sites along the Drysdale River in the Kimberley, and we called them Dry 001. So Dry 001 site description. Really simple stuff. So we want a location. We'll cover this in the practical sessions, but there are coordinate systems out there that you need to use. So for example, there's a datum, GDA 94, that works on basic longitude and latitude coordinate system. just to make sure. So these are your latitude and longitude or decimal degrees that we use. Nothing wrong with using that. Many people use it, as long as you say you're using datum GA24. Just to confuse systems, there's the map grid system in which you have MGA 94. So this is a different map projection in which the country is divided up into these zones. These are in UTMs, and so you then have to say which UTM zone you are in, for example. It's a different system. It doesn't really matter which system you use. What really is important, though, is that you're consistent. So if you consistently use one system and there's a fault with that system, you can track that fault back through each of your uses. But if you're using multiple different systems, it's just a mess, it's just confusing. You can be wrong, that's fine, as long as you're consistently wrong. So these are just two of the coordinate systems. Then make a map. You've got a location, you've got a coordinate, so make a map of the site. It can be really simple, done in 30 seconds, a little site map and how to get there. Or you can have, and we'll be doing datum and dumpy and total station and differential GPS, you can make a map accurate, to 2 millimeters of where every artifact, feature, etc. is. Depends how much time and resources you have. But at a minimum, make a little map. Your notebook should be a combination of text and images and sketches and maps and those kinds of things. Here you get some examples of sketch mapping. Sometimes you just use a simple tape and compass. You align a tape along a compass bearing and you record all the sites along it and you produce something like this. Quite rough and ready, but it's got data over here which you later then use in your research. Right, the site forms themselves. There are all sorts of different site forms. They're not right or wrong. They're specific to a particular project. It's good to have a standardized format. So for example, you'll want to have which institution and researcher is at work, what are your coordinates, give a broad description of the site. What sort of site is this? I'll get onto this in a few slides, but is it a rock art site? Is it a colonial site? Is it an ethnographic site? Is it a human remains site? Because these all, if you have something like human remains, you've got all sorts of other laws and ethics that apply. Try and put as much information in as possible because we're multidisciplinary. Lots of people work with us. When you say it's a rock shelter, the geologists are going to ask, well, what rock is it made of? Is it Wharton sandstone, King Leopold sandstone? Is it basalt? Those kinds of things. So try and put that sort of information in. If you don't know, say you don't know, but you could do things like take a photograph of the rock shelter, another form of information, and the geologist can look at that photograph and tell you what sandstone it is. Always have a section for notes or for other, in which things that don't fit in the standardized fields, you can put them in. Maybe you, for example, have someone who has knowledge of the site, who has ethnographic knowledge, and they tell this to you. You could record that, or you could write it down in that other section. So these are just some examples. This is from the textbook, an Archaeologist Fields notebook, where they have a particular survey form, for example, for cemeteries, and another one for excavations, which is more visual. You're excavating in quadrats, and you weigh buckets, and you've got standardized fields for all of these different kinds of things. These days we tend to use tablets. We'll be using these as well when we do our site excavation. They're very efficient, particularly on the back end. When you leave the field, it's easy to transport the information out and manipulate it, but they can break, they can get corrupted. So back up the information from the tablet, do it every day that you're in the field, and make sure you have that same information in other formats, your field notebook, photos, video recordings, audio recordings, and those kinds of things. The description in your recording will vary. As I say, always try and be standardized and put as much information in as possible. To get back to the site will be expensive in terms of money and possibly permission. So while you're there, do as much as you can. Remember, we're enjoying what we do, but it is also a job of work. So you need to work hard. As I said before, use text and image to complement each other. Be precise about what it is you think you're seeing. If you don't know, just put a little question mark. Because if you don't put a question mark, someone else reading your report will say, oh, she said it is an historic dwelling. And it might not be. It might be a natural formation of stones. Give an idea of the extent of the site. Is it big or small? What sort of artifacts are there? Are there any threats to the site? Is it a colonial farmhouse that is being vandalized by people? Or is it naturally decaying by wind, water, and those different things? Maybe it's in a hurricane zone. And I'll keep stressing this, but be consistent in the way in which you describe and record sites. Moving on to finds, we'll cover this a lot more in the lecture on doing fieldwork. But on the bags we develop a code for the artifacts we recover from surface collections and excavations as well. So here, for example, we can't put the whole thing in and take forever to write, but this is how the code works. This is from the US. So they have a system, a statewide system, whereas here everyone will understand 47 ARCY3013. 47 is Wisconsin, the 47th state. LC is the county, La Crosse County, and this happens to be the 333rd site recorded in that country. Then the F4E1/2, that tells you it's feature 14 and it's in the eastern half of that feature. You're in level 9 of the excavation and you're 60 to 65 centimeters below datum. So the datum, I forgot to tell you this, although this is we're covering datum and doing field work, but every site needs a datum. A datum is a single point, single geographic point. Sometimes people put a peg in the ground, and from that point you make all your measurements of the site. All the measurements of the site have to relate back to that point. So the datum is a fixed point at a site and everything's measured from it. So this particular feature was found 60 to 65 centimeters below the surface of the datum. And then you have this over here, which is simply the date in which it's excavated. These codes, as long as they have keys that interpret them, they just need to be quick, efficient, and unique. You don't want to have the same code for 2 different sites, for example. Similarly, in your description, you're working for your particular project, but you have to keep other archaeological research that's going to happen in the future in mind. Is your work suitable for people to use? We have a particular way of working, largely scientific, very consistent, easy to understand, easy for other people to understand. But it's not the only way of working. We work with other stakeholders, indigenous communities, etc., that have other ways of understanding those artifacts, and we need to acknowledge those. We don't have to agree with them. Sometimes we are in dispute with people, but we do need to acknowledge that there are those ways and that our recordings need to be sensitive to those. That said, often you're working in a contract environment, a heritage management environment, you're working for a client, and people might ask you to say, prove it. And so you have to establish a chain of evidence or a chain of custody throughout all of your field work. That is, relates to the before going into the field, making sure all your permits and permissions are in order, that your plan was adequate, that you had all your OH&S in tow, that you were looking at the right questions that the client was asking you to look at, or that your research design was telling you to look at, that your field work was consistent. A person can take an artifact out of a bag and from the metadata trace where that artifact came back from. You have to be able to do all of those different kinds of things, and that happens throughout your project, the before, during, and after. So that description and how we record sites is absolutely vital. There's lots more, but this is one of the last slides I'm going to show you, because otherwise you'll just be listening to me all day. We've got lots of other ways of recording: photographs, 3D scanning, drones, oral histories. The technologies are evolving. These days, some of the 3D scans, we recently did one up in the Kimberley, it took 700 million data points to create a lattice work for a site and reconstruct how the site had evolved over time. Fantastic stuff. So there'll be lots more ways of recording a site. Just think, what is the minimum standard I need? I need a location, I need a description, and then what can I add to that to enrich my documentation? What technology is available? What time do I have? What skills do I have? All of that kind of thing. We want a lot of different kinds of information, but the information must be clean and contextualized. We mustn't say, oh, I'm not sure where this artifact came from. You must make every effort to be sure where that artifact came from. And throughout this process, you need to involve the different stakeholders we work with as far as possible. So, in summary, this is one of the skills we have in archaeology. It's an essential skill to recognize and record sites. It's a skill anyone can learn. It's not that difficult. But you do need practice. You need to get out in the field. You need to seek opportunities to do field work and be involved in projects to develop the skill. So at a minimum, record the location, have a little map, and do the description. People can then revisit the site and recover more information. Sometimes you've only got a few minutes at a site. I've recorded site in literally less than 5 minutes because the helicopter was running out of fuel and about to take off, and if I didn't get on, I would have 7 days walk through some pretty nasty country. So you learn to record fast. Also, we have long-term research projects where over 5 years we go back to the same site and we constantly record and data and deepen our knowledge about the site. So it's a very exciting time to be in archaeology. There are lots of new ways of recognizing and recording sites and finding sites. Next time, the next lecture deals with the actual doing of the fieldwork. So this lecture concludes the before section of archaeological project management, and the next lecture we get into the actual doing. So thanks for your attention, and I'll see you at the practical sessions.